All right, start it.
Okay, so hello, welcome. This is the SIG storage weekly meeting on volume populators. Today, our main agenda is to go over Tim's feedback for the KEP, which merged provisionally, or I don't know what you want to call it, Tim, but
I think it's provisional. Yeah.
Yeah, it did merge, but we just wanted to basically settle on all the loose ends. And so I've sort of gone over your KEP feedback and made 5 points out of what you wrote that we should go over. The first one I wanted to cover was the question of whether to use an async controller or a validating webhook for PVCs and their data sources. We originally did have a validating webhook that would throw out PVCs with data sources that we considered invalid. And then we scrapped that and went to a async controller instead. And the idea was that, in Kubernetes, generally you want to be able to declare what you want and then satisfy the dependencies and eventually get what you asked for. And we didn't like the idea of, like, if someone was using a declarative GitOps style workflow where you had all of your YAML checked in somewhere and you just wanted to sort of shove it into Kubernetes and wait for it to get satisfied, that your PVCs might get rejected on the basis that they had a data source that depended on a volume populator which wasn't installed yet. Because typically what would happen is if you ended up on a Kubernetes cluster that didn't have the volume populator to satisfy the specific request that you had, is that you would just install it and then your PVCs would get populated. So it seemed better to have an asynchronous controller that just notifies you that, hey, there is nothing that is watching for this particular data source, but if you install it, if you do install the correct volume populator, then this PVC will bind. We just didn't want to have a situation where, like, you created a PVC with a data source and, like, you never got any feedback forever and you didn't know what was wrong. So an async controller felt better than a validating webhook for that kind of case. And I wanted to know if you agree or if you have a different opinion.
So let me walk you through my thought process and we'll see if there's a conclusion. In general, you are right. We don't always hard fail on things that are trying to link together. And like example of this would be you can create a pod that references a secret and the secret doesn't exist yet, right?
Yeah.
And the pod will delay until the secret is available and then you can go ahead and use it. And that gives people freedom in, like you said, just throwing a blob of YAML at the server and letting it, reorder how it needs to. The distinction there is, or an important distinction, is that both the pod and the service in that example are user owned, right? And so, like, it's entirely likely that they may come in through the same, like, set of very quick operations, right? Maybe the same Git repo or something. And just because they came in out of order doesn't mean that they won't be resolved. Versus depending on something that is like a system configuration and doesn't exist and is invalid. We have examples where we fail on those sorts of things too, right? Like if you ask a service for an IP address that is outside of the valid range, it will hard fail you at service creation time because that's not something that a user is expected to be able to rectify for themselves. Now, I say that, and at the same time, our API is filled with places where we have object refs with a kind, and the kind isn't validated synchronously. So if I reference a foobar and the foobar doesn't exist, like, my thing's just not going to work, or it's going to act funny, and it's really up to the controller to interpret that however it wants. And we don't have any formalization around that, and that sort of feels like what we're talking about here, right? Like you just haven't installed the foobar. But it's a little bit different in that I'm referencing something that does exist. I'm referencing a pod, only a pod hasn't been registered as a data source. So it's very similar in form, but it's a little different in the details. I went back and forth in my head about that, trying to figure out what, as a user, what would I expect to happen? I'm a big fan of synchronous errors when possible. But I'm not sure that doing it async is any worse than what we do in other places. So I'm not going to take a hard opinion on this. At the end of the day, this is not my API to own, right? And if the UX is problematic, you'll hear about it, not me.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
I
I'm
mean,
okay with that.
my strong opinion is just that the user needs to get some feedback. We really didn't want was you create the PVC and it just sits there and nothing happens forever. So
Oh,
we
absolutely.
wanted to make sure that you at least got a clue why your PVC wasn't binding. And yeah, I feel less strongly about whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. When we did implement the validating webhook, it was sort of heavier weight, and yeah, the failures are more jarring, especially relative to the existing. So we need to talk about the existing behavior and why it's so weird,
Yeah.
and why this might be a smoother transition from the existing behavior than just going straight to like, for your PVC ignores the data source field to your PVC just doesn't get created at all.
Yes.
So that takes us to the next point.
Let me interject one more
Okay.
possibility. Knowing full well how much work is involved in setting up admission controllers and everything else, we may choose to shy away from this. But one of the things that I think is interesting that was added recently is the ability to do API level warnings. Now, Liget's not here, so I don't know how he would feel about using that for this purpose, but perhaps it would be interesting to get an API level warning that says, hey, I'm going to take this PVC, but just so you know, the populator that you're referencing isn't registered. Like, it's not going to work until you do something.
Yeah.
To do that, you would have to have effectively both a synchronous and an asynchronous controller. You would be defining your UX in terms of it's going to work asynchronously, but I'm going to throw a synchronous warning instead of an error. I don't know if it's worth the effort, but it might be something worth looking into.
Is that something a validating webhook is able to generate as its output?
99% sure, yes.
Okay, so if we decide warning is better than hard failure, we can do that through a webhook. It's just we have to write that code.
Yes.
Or
So you'd
does
have
that
to register the webhook and then return that warning block. I've not done that myself from a webhook, so I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism is, but I'm pretty sure, I'm almost certain you can do that from a webhook.
Okay.
And now,
Awesome.
like I said, I don't know how Jordan would feel. That's not really what it was intended for. It was intended mostly for things like API deprecations. Hey, you're using a deprecated foobar. You should use the V1 foobar instead of the V1 beta 1. But it seems to me like once we have an error, a warning channel rather, like we can find lots of interesting ways to use it. And this doesn't seem wholly inappropriate to me.
Yeah. Okay. That's
I have
another.
an unrelated kind of dumb question about validation. I know in the core validation code for core Kubernetes objects, multi-object validation wasn't allowed. For webhooks, as I understand it, it is allowed. Is it discouraged or?
It's generally not done because it's just not going to be efficient, right? It means
it's
that
racy, isn't it?
well, it's always going to be racy, but it's just not super efficient because now you have to store the cache of all the other things that you're looking at in order to do it. We do stuff in a few places, like we have the admission controller for setting defaults on storage classes, right? And that watches all the storage classes and keeps an in-memory concept of who is the default and modifies things. So it's not like we never ever do any of this, but with validation specifically, we've tried to set the rule of you want to be isolated to the individual resource, partially because just the REST infrastructure isn't set up to do cross-object validations. By the time you get down into the validation hook, you don't always have access to the things you might want. Often a webhook, I mean, it's kind of the Wild West. You can kind of do whatever you want, and as long as it's acceptable performance and resource footprint, like who's going to question you? I would encourage you to try not to if you can avoid it.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Saad?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's good feedback. So yeah, let's get on to the existing behavior when this data source field was introduced was that if it isn't a thing that the API server wants to allow, it just zeroes it out and you get an empty volume. I guess we can all agree that wasn't the best design, but it's what's been shipping for like 2 years now. So the question is what to do once this new any data source feature gate gets flipped on. So the existing implementation of the any data source feature gate is when you flip it on, it starts allowing anything except a core object. And we can talk about that, about the decision to specifically disallow core objects. But the other question is, for things that we still want to disallow, is just zeroing it to match the existing behavior still reasonable, or should we try to correct the mistake of the past and start like rejecting those?
So zeroing it out was a terrible decision. No, I mean, that's a little bit heavy. We have a general principle that we don't modify user input. So if the user said X and X doesn't work, then we either reject it outright or we throw events or something. We fail to reconcile or however we're going to handle it, but we don't just wipe it out. And the only case where we do wipe it out is things that are feature gated, right? So part of me wonders if this is like a vestigial part of the feature gating logic that just got carried over or something.
I think it was just a like inadvertent, nobody intended this to happen, but didn't look closely at the code and it happened kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right. So we shouldn't ignore user input. And even, I'm sorry, there's, let's put it on a spectrum, right? Like the worst thing to do is to erase the user input or change it in this case. Slightly better than that would be to just outright ignore it, right? But that's still pretty hostile. Better would have been to actually say, whoa, this isn't going to work, and throw an event or something and then ignore it. And probably the correct answer would have been, you specified something that I don't know how to work with, I'm not going to work. And that's not where we are. So the question now is, A, are we going to make it any worse? And then B, how do we make it better? So let's not make it worse. I don't think this is going to make it worse, right?
So Tim, the correct behavior is saying, I think this might have to do with the feature gate, because initially when this was introduced, this is a feature gated. So you basically remove it if the feature gate is not enabled. So are you saying maybe that's correct when it's feature gated? When we remove the feature gate, we are supposed to give the, but then that makes sense, right? That's why if it's a feature gated, it's not supported, then we
right.
What we could have done is when we introduced snapshots, we could have said, okay, if you specify a snapshot and the feature gate is turned on, we allow it. If you specify a snapshot and the feature gate is turned off, we ignore that. But if you specify anything other than a snapshot, you get an error. And like we never did that third thing.
But then the third thing, I think, is because we are allowing everything. I guess that's probably why the confusion comes, right? Any feature, any data source is like anything. Maybe that's why it's getting weird.
So the as if rule, or as if not exists rule for feature gates is that if the feature gate is off, the system should behave as if that field is not defined. And what do we do with, you can specify anything you want in a YAML, and if that doesn't map to a field that we understand, we just discard it, right? So if the feature gate is off, we should just pretend that field doesn't exist. And there's a little asterisk on that because we have to retain data in the case of a rollback and roll forward. So there's all, if you look at all the drop disabled fields functions, there's always the if feature gate not enabled and not in use, right? For the update path. But the correct thing to do when the gate came, when we got rid of this gate, would have been to say, if you've specified anything that we don't understand, throw an error, throw an event, like decide what the error handling is, but don't just wipe it out.
Well, the other problem was this field was associated with two different feature gates that moved from alpha to beta to GA on different schedules. And so it was like the field is just the data source field, and which data source was allowed was the thing that was feature gated. So there wasn't an easy way to say, to do as you say, just pretend it wasn't there when the feature gate is off, because it affects other things that are also sharing that field.
Yes, this is there's a problem in general of evolving the API with new effectively enumerated values and having a feature gate, right?
Yes.
Because I can pretend a field doesn't exist, but if you're adding a new value to an enumeration, how do I pretend that you didn't specify an invalid value on an older version, right?
That's exactly what we're facing with here.
Yeah, and we don't have a really good general answer for that, honestly. It hasn't come up often enough that we've had to really deal with it.
Okay.
In this case, I would say rule number one is be compatible. So even if I don't like the existing behavior, we should probably not silently break existing behavior unless we're really, really, really confident that this is not in any way being used or depended on. And even then, we probably shouldn't break it. What we could do is separate the problems. So in the new model where anything is allowed, it's anything but core. And if you specify something core, we will retain the existing behavior and we will create a new cap that says, how do we fix that? We shouldn't have been ignoring it. We should at the very least be throwing events and API warnings, right? Something. We should be screaming from the hilltops, you've done something that we don't understand.
Yeah.
Right, but we can make that a separate KEP to do it. But I will ask that like we actually please do that, because I think this is something worth fixing and not perpetuating. Like I don't want anybody to ever look at this and think that this is the way to do things.
One simple way to do that would be to change the feature gate to literally allow anything, so that we never discarded the user input, but then modify the populator, the data source validator controller, which is part of this populator KEP, to explicitly not allow populators to act on core objects. And so you always get the warning that says you've specified something that's not valid when you create a PVC that, say, points to a pod.
But it would still work, right? We're not going to, like, somewhere out there is a user who's done the wrong thing, right?
The difference would be that that your PVC would exist and it would have a data source that said, you know, pod, my pod, with an API group of the empty string, and it would never ever bind to anything because we would explicitly disallow a populator from acting on pods. And I wanted to, there's a brief digression about why we wanted to disallow core things, and it's related to every populator has to have a unique, in order to avoid two populators from ever stepping on each other's toes, we have to sort of make a rule that says, if you write a populator, you must also define a new CRD that is the thing that you're populating from. And it always has to be a new thing so that you can never have two populators fighting over the same kind of object. If you really wanted to have a populator that knew how to take a pod and turn it into a PVC, you would have a new level of indirection in the middle, like some new CRD that points to the pod. The PVC would point to that thing, and then the populator would be watching for that thing and know how to take that and turn it into a PVC. And then if somebody else,
it's sort of an intermediate like target plus policy, right? The effectively, what do you mean by a pod? Like, sorry, I'm gonna back up. What does it mean to take a snapshot of a pod? That could be interpreted n different ways, right? So this intermediate type is both a statement of which pod, but also which interpretation.
Yes, yes. So, and because core objects are sort of owned by the community, we would never allow them to be directly the source of these things unless it was like a core populator, which I don't think anyone's thinking about yet. So as long as all the populators are third parties, we just say you go write your own CRD, and of course those aren't going to be core objects, so it seems to make sense to just exclude them.
That makes a lot of sense, and the explanation holds water for why we would not want to, or why we would require this intermediate thing. That makes sense to me. So I guess what I really want to see here is some documentation that says this is the existing behavior and we're working on a KEP to refine the existing behavior. We shouldn't break existing users. If there's someone out there who's doing the wrong thing and pointing it to a pod and their PVC is working happily, like suppose I put pod in there and you just erase pod for me and my volume is created and I'm happy with it. Don't break that user, right? Throw a warning, throw an event, do something to make some noise. That's okay. don't break them.
Well,
That is
okay,
rule.
what you're saying, I mean, today the behavior is if you put garbage or something invalid in the data source field, we zero it out and you end up with an empty volume. And what you're saying is we should support users who are depending on that ability to put garbage in the field, because that's sort of a exceptionally strong level of backwards compatibility to say, even if people are throwing garbage at us, we should continue to accept the garbage and behave good.
Yes, but that is the bar that we really want to meet, I think.
Okay.
Like, we should never have accepted the garbage in the first place, but we have to live with our mistakes, right?
Yeah, but I mean, part of the evolution of this new any data source field is some stuff will, some stuff that you threw at us that would have resulted in getting an empty volume will now result in waiting for a populator to do something. So like we are changing the behavior for the data sources that contain pointers to actual things. It's
yes,
just that,
but you would have also had to have registered that thing as a data populator, which seems like it's unlikely enough to happen in complete isolation, especially given that you're saying you can't attach a populator to a pod, you have to attach it to an intermediate thing, right? And that intermediate thing can't be core. So somebody intentionally created that intermediate thing, registered that CRD, registered it as a valid populator, right? Like the sort of confluence of those things all happening and me having specified garbage seems so diminishingly small.
yeah.
Tell me I'm wrong.
So I think it's subjective because you could make the same argument about core objects. There's like, why would someone have put a core object in there if the behavior is you're always going to get an empty volume? They should have quickly figured out that, oh, it's ignoring this thing. I'm not going to put that core object in the field anymore. Let's break it into two parts. There's the I put a core object in there, which previously would get wiped out, right? Yeah.
But a non-core object would not get wiped out, right?
Well, no, that's the problem. Is today when the feature gate is still alpha and turned off, you also get an empty volume. And when you turn this feature gate on, what we're going to do is we're going to start allowing those data sources through, and you won't get an empty volume. You will either get what you really asked for if there is a populator, or you'll get nothing if there's no populator. You won't get an empty volume.
I see.
And it has to work that way so that we can allow new populators to be written. We have to say, well, you know what, if you put something in there. I mean, I guess we do like a mutating webhook that says, if there is a populator, allow it through, and if the populator hasn't been registered, emulate the old behavior by zeroing it out and giving them an empty volume. That would be the only way to really maintain strong backwards compatibility. But that's re-implementing the bad behavior,
right,
of mutating their input.
Right. Okay. Right. That's a good nuance. I'm not sure what I'd want. I don't. What you just described is probably the farthest thing from what I really want. I'd like to see a path towards more normal behavior.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask a question, which is, if we keep the user value, and then when a volume populator is not found, it goes and creates an empty volume, that would preserve the behavior, and we would start to save that thing. We can asynchronously alert the user that says you have this thing, and it can move us in that direction. Or am I missing a huge piece of this? I apologize if I am.
To implement that behavior would require like changing the CSI sidecars and stuff, but I think it might be possible, but it's also a weird idea. I'd have to think that one through to basically preserve the input, but I mean, not discard the input, but preserve the behavior of you still get an empty volume if we can't figure out what it is. I worry about how the strange behaviors that will occur for like populators that that do exist but weren't registered yet at the moment you made the request. That's sort of where you would get the strangest behavior.
Yeah, exactly. That fails the like async reconciliation point that you started with, right? You want somebody to be able to register with something that is unknown and have it block until the unknown thing becomes known.
Yeah.
If you retain the value but do something different, then that is impossible, right? If this goes a little bit back to the, is it user controlled or system controlled? But if I registered with a populator from a foobar and it doesn't exist and I get an empty volume and then my pod doesn't do what I want it to do because the foobar isn't initialized, or the volume isn't initialized from the foobar, then I call my administrator and say, oh, right, you need to install this foobar extension. And then they do, and then I have to tear down everything I've done and do it over again.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a weird UX.
That sort of closely matches today's behavior, right? Today, if you somehow had using Kubernetes 120 and the feature gates turned off, and you try it, that's exactly what will happen, because we just discard the data source that we don't know about. The difference is there will be no record in the PVC that you ever asked for anything. It'll just look like you asked for an empty volume. So we could change that aspect of it, but if we don't change the other aspect of it, it's still kind of broken. My inclination is if we say that we don't want to preserve this weird behavior, we could just make the statement that says, look, nobody depends on putting invalid things in the data source because that would be an insane thing to do, right? If they're doing it today and they're getting empty volumes, like they're going to figure out that putting something in the data source field didn't achieve what they wanted and they'll stop doing it.
Or they did something, never check. I mean, this is the more likely path, and from my experience with Kubernetes users, they did something that they thought made sense. It worked in the sense that it didn't fail, which isn't the same as working correctly, but it didn't fail. So they went about their business and they forgot entirely that they put that data in there, and it's now checked into their Git or whatever. And at some point in the future, they will try to do it again, and that operation that used to succeed will now fail. And the question is, A, is that likely? And B, do we care enough to jump through the hoops to try to be compatible? I'm going to set a really high bar. We are going to run out of time, it turns out. I want to set a really high bar for compatibility, but I also want to be realistic. If you think that this is a completely nonsensical situation and you can actually claim like that was a bug, then I want to give you some degrees of freedom to try to do the right thing. But I just want to emphasize, like, if you can be compatible, you should.
We can be compatible, but it means the long-term behavior will always be a little weird, and I don't think we'll ever get to the great place we would like to get to unless we make some sort of break with the past. And if we're going to make any break with the past, like, this might be the time to do it.
You mean while it's young?
Yeah, like before we start telling people like, oh, you can put stuff in the data source field that's not a snapshot or another volume. And you're going to get this new behavior, and we're going to tell all the deployers, you need to install this new controller and this volume populator CRD. This is the mechanism for registering them. When we're doing that, might be a good time to sort of say, okay, if you're putting garbage in the data source field, we're not going to zero it out for you anymore, and you're going to start getting unbound PVCs instead of empty PVCs. And I can credibly claim that was a bug. I believe that nobody intended that to happen. We're all here saying, no, that's not what we wanted to do. It just was a side effect of the feature gate process as we implemented volume cloning and snapshot cloning.
So perhaps it's a reasonable path then to, let's lean on, let me throw the suggestion out. Don't take this as hard, let's do it, but think about, what if we had a new cap that simply was, don't wipe populator fields when they are not recognized, right? And we call that a distinct thing. Like this was a bug, it was an error. Strictly speaking, this would be an incompatible change, but we don't think it's a meaningful change because it doesn't do anything and it isn't supposed to work, right? And we can make the argument for that on its own, right? And we'll want to just
inside 121 or wait for 122 to.
Well, so that's the rub, isn't it? Obviously the enhancement freeze is come and gone. I wonder what the enhancement folks would say about taking a cap and actually splitting it into two for tracking purposes, right? Like these are really, they were lumped together. We really want to distinguish them because we want to discuss them independently and we think they deserve independent release notes. I think we can make a case for, we're not adding a new enhancement, but we are coming up with more fine-grained tracking of it. I don't know what they'd feel about it, but I think it's worth asking.
Okay.
Can you call it a bug fixing then? Can call that a bug fixing?
We can call it a bug fix, but this is of enough scope that I think a KEP is worth. A KEP is how you get release notes, right? That's like the most important way. It's not the only way, but it's the best way to get a visible release note, and to raise this to the attention of people who might care about this. So,
Okay.
I
don't want
to doing the work to split the cap, and because we're past time, I'd like to wonder, do you want to come back next week and continue this discussion on Tuesday?
Yeah, let me look at the calendar real quick.
Or I mean, we can in the intervening time think about that proposal and how we could split it and decide, you know, is it a bug really or not?
I can do the first half next week. I can do 10 to 10:30.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, so let's take the action item to reach out to somebody on the enhancement side. I don't know exactly who you want to talk to, but just jump on the Slack channel for enhancements and like, let's open a discussion. This is I think, uncharted territory. And we want to get their feeling for how they want to handle it.
Okay.
Because I don't want to work around them, but strictly speaking, this KEP is already in, so we could lump it in with this KEP and be within the letter of the law, but I don't feel like it's within the spirit, and I'd rather be within the spirit if we can.
Yeah. Okay. And you covered all the most important stuff, so it sounds like we just need to close on this one, and maybe we can, if we get more time next week, we can cover the other 2 points.
Okay.
They're not so important. Thank you. And I'm also late for a meeting, so I think we probably all have to drop.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.